The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Greenwood High, casting a warm glow across the classroom. The light danced on the walls, illuminating the rows of desks and the colorful posters that had long since faded from the attention of the students. It should have been a cheerful scene, but for Layla Johnson, the brightness outside only made the shadows in her mind feel darker. She clutched her worn notebook tightly to her chest as if it could shield her from the snickers and whispers that seemed to follow her everywhere. The sound was faint, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but to Layla, it was as loud as thunder. "Did you see her hair today?" one girl whispered from the front of the room. "I bet she didn't even do her homework," a boy snickered. Layla kept her gaze firmly on her desk, her fingers gripping the edges of her notebook as if holding on for dear life. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she forced herself to take deep breaths. The door swung open, and the room immediately fell silent. Mrs. Cromwell, the teacher who could command a room with a single look, strode in. Her sharp heels clicked against the floor, and her presence alone seemed to suck the warmth from the air. "Let's begin," Mrs. Cromwell said, glancing at the large silver watch on her wrist. Her voice was crisp and biting, carrying an authority that left no room for debate. She didn't look at the students so much as she inspected them, her gaze lingering just a moment longer on Layla. Layla shifted in her seat, trying to make herself smaller. Her desk was in the back row, tucked away like a forgotten piece of furniture, and yet she couldn't escape Mrs. Cromwell's sharp eyes. Her mother's voice played in her mind, a soft reminder from the hurried morning before school. "Keep your head high, Layla," her mother had said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "People will always show you who they are, don't let it shake you." Layla had nodded then, trying to absorb the strength in her mother's words, but now, in the harsh reality of the classroom, they felt like distant echoes. Mrs. Cromwell's gaze swept across the room as she began her lecture, but the tension in the air was palpable. Layla could feel it pressing down on her, a weight she carried every day. She tried to focus on the words on the board, but the whispers from earlier replayed in her mind. "Layla," Mrs. Cromwell called suddenly, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Layla's head snapped up, her pulse quickening. She hadn't realized Mrs. Cromwell was speaking to her until every pair of eyes in the room turned in her direction. "Are you with us?" Mrs. Cromwell asked, raising an eyebrow. Her tone was sharp, each word laced with a hint of condescension. "Yes, ma'am," Layla mumbled, her voice barely audible. "Good. Then perhaps you can answer the question on the board," Mrs. Cromwell said, gesturing with her pen. Layla's stomach sank. She hadn't been paying attention, and the question on the board might as well have been written in a foreign language. She stared at it, willing the answer to come to her, but her mind was blank. The room was silent, but the weight of the stairs made her feel as though she were under a spotlight. "Well," Mrs. Cromwell pressed, crossing her arms. I don't know," Layla admitted, her voice trembling. Mrs. Cromwell sighed, the sound exaggerated and heavy. "I expected as much," she said, shaking her head. "If you spent less time daydreaming and more time paying attention, perhaps you wouldn't be so lost." A wave of giggles rippled through the classroom. Layla felt her cheeks flush with heat, her humiliation burning brighter than the sunlight streaming through the windows. Her grip on her notebook tightened, her knuckles turning white. She wanted to speak up, to defend herself, but her voice felt trapped, stuck somewhere between her heart and her throat. Mrs. Cromwell turned back to the board, her dismissal of Layla complete. For a moment, Layla allowed herself to glance around the room. Most of her classmates were focused on the teacher again, but a few exchanged smirks or raised eyebrows, their expressions dripping with unspoken judgment. One girl in the row next to her, a quiet observer who rarely spoke, offered a fleeting look of sympathy before quickly averting her eyes. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make Layla's heart ache just a little less. As Mrs. Cromwell continued her lecture, Layla's mind drifted back to her mother's words. People will always show you who they are. She looked at Mrs. Cromwell, her cold expression unchanging, and the students around her, their laughter still ringing in her ears. Layla realized her mother had been right. The people around her were showing her exactly who they were. But Layla also remembered the second part of her mother's advice: don't let it shake you. She took a deep breath, letting the air fill her lungs before exhaling slowly. She straightened in her seat, her shoulders relaxing just a little. The whispers, the giggles, the sharp words, they stung, but they didn't define her. Layla didn't know what the rest of the day would bring, but one thing was clear: she would endure. For now, that was enough. But deep down, she knew this wasn't the end of the story. Something was coming, something that would change everything. Layla clutched her notebook once more, not as a shield, but as a reminder of the strength she carried within her. The classroom buzzed around her, but she focused on one thought: she wouldn't let them break her. The sunlight continued to filter through the windows, but its warmth was no match for the icy tension that hung in the air. Layla forced herself to keep her gaze forward, focusing on the chalkboard where Mrs. Cromwell scribbled equations with mechanical precision. Her handwriting was sharp, almost angry, as if the very act of teaching annoyed her. Layla tried to follow along, but her mind kept wandering. It wasn't the lesson that distracted her, it was the weight of everything she carried with her every day. The stares, the whispers, the feeling of being judged for reasons she couldn't control. She thought back to her mother again, imagining the calm strength in her voice, the way she always seemed to know exactly what to say. Layla. Mrs. Cromwell's voice cut through Layla's thoughts like a knife. She blinked, realizing too late that the teacher was standing right in front of her desk. "Were you even listening?" Mrs. Cromwell asked, her eyes narrowing. "Yes, ma'am," Layla said quickly, though her voice betrayed her hesitation. "Really? Then you won't mind solving this problem for the class," Mrs. Cromwell said, stepping aside and gesturing toward the board. Layla froze. She hadn't been paying attention to the problem, and the jumble of numbers and symbols on the board might as well have been gibberish. Slowly, she stood, her legs feeling like lead as she made her way to the front of the room. The whispers started again, quiet but unmistakable, like a low hum of static in her ears. "Bet she doesn't even know how to hold the chalk," someone murmured, followed by stifled laughter. Layla gripped the piece of chalk Mrs. Cromwell handed her, her fingers trembling. She stared at the board, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of the equation. "Well?" Mrs. Cromwell prompted, tapping her foot impatiently. I don't know," Layla admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Cromwell let out a long, exaggerated sigh, turning to face the class. "This is what happens when you don't pay attention," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "Perhaps someone else can show Layla how it's done." A hand shot up near the front of the room. Chloe Adams, the star student who never missed an opportunity to show off. She practically skipped to the board, her confidence radiating with every step. "Let me," Chloe said with a wide smile, taking the chalk from Layla's hand without so much as a glance in her direction. Layla stepped back, feeling the sting of humiliation wash over her again. She returned to her seat, her head low, as Chloe rattled off the answer effortlessly. "Excellent work, Chloe," Mrs. Cromwell said, her voice warm and approving in a way it never was with Layla. "See, class. This is what happens when you apply yourself." The praise felt like a dagger. Layla clenched her fists under her desk, willing herself not to cry. As the lesson continued, Layla sank further into her seat, wishing she could disappear entirely. The rest of the class seemed to pass in a blur, with Mrs. Cromwell's voice droning on and the occasional burst of laughter breaking the monotony. Finally, the bell rang, signaling the end of the period. Layla quickly gathered her things, hoping to slip out unnoticed. But as she reached the door, Mrs. Cromwell's voice stopped her. "Layla, a moment," the teacher said. Layla froze, her hand on the door frame. Slowly, she turned around, her stomach churning. "Yes, ma'am," she said, her voice barely audible. Mrs. Cromwell looked at her with a mixture of pity and irritation. "I don't know what's going on with you, but you need to start trying harder. This isn't the time to daydream your way through life." Layla nodded mutely, not trusting herself to speak. "You can go," Mrs. Cromwell said with a dismissive wave of her hand. Layla hurried out of the room, her heart pounding. She made her way to her next class, but the sting of Mrs. Cromwell's words lingered. During lunch, Layla sat alone at her usual table in the corner of the cafeteria. She picked at her food, her appetite gone. Around her, the room buzzed with chatter and laughter, but it felt like a world apart. She pulled out her notebook, flipping to a blank page. Writing had always been her escape, a way to make sense of the chaos around her. She let the pen glide across the page, her thoughts spilling out in a rush of words. "Dear Mom," she wrote, "I'm trying. I really am. But it's so hard. No matter what I do, it feels like I'm not enough. Mrs. Cromwell hates me, and I don't even know why. The kids here, they don't understand me. They don't even try. I wish you were here right now. You always know what to say. You always make me feel like I can handle anything. I just don't know if I can keep doing this." She stopped writing, her hand trembling. Tears blurred her vision, and she quickly wiped them away before anyone could see. As the day wore on, Layla tried to push the morning's events out of her mind, but the weight of them lingered. By the time the final bell rang, she felt drained, her energy sapped by the constant effort of holding herself together. She walked home slowly, the sounds of the neighborhood fading into the background as she lost herself in thought. When she reached her house, her mother was waiting for her on the porch, a warm smile lighting up her face. "Hey, sweetheart," her mother said, opening her arms for a hug. Layla sank into her mother's embrace, feeling a surge of comfort she hadn't realized she needed so desperately. "How was school?" her mother asked, pulling back to look at her. Layla hesitated, then shrugged. "It was okay," she said softly, not meeting her mother's eyes. Her mother studied her for a moment, her expression gentle but probing. "Layla, you know you can talk to me about anything, right?" "I know," Layla said, her voice barely a whisper. Her mother nodded, giving her shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "Come inside. Let's talk over some tea." As they sat at the kitchen table, Layla found herself opening up, the words spilling out faster than she could control them. She told her mother about Mrs. Cromwell, the taunts, the whispers, and the feeling of being invisible yet constantly targeted. Her mother listened quietly, her face calm but her eyes blazing with a protective fire. When Layla finished, her mother reached across the table, taking her hand in hers. "Layla, listen to me," her mother said firmly. "You are smart. You are capable. And you are so much more than what these people see. Don't ever let anyone make you feel small, not Mrs. Cromwell, not anyone. Do you hear me?" Layla nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "And as for Mrs. Cromwell," her mother added, a determined glint in her eye, "I think it's time I had a little chat with her." Layla's eyes widened. "Mom, no, you don't have to." "I do," her mother said firmly. "Because no one, and I mean no one, gets to treat my daughter like she's less than she is." Layla felt a flicker of hope ignite in her chest. Maybe things would be different. Maybe this time, someone would finally stand up for her. And as she went to bed that night, she couldn't help but wonder what the next day would bring. Mrs. Cromwell's voice sliced through the classroom like a sharp blade, commanding attention and leaving no room for argument. "Layla," she barked, her tone dripping with mockery, "if you're quite done daydreaming, perhaps you can answer the question on the board. Or is it too much for you to handle?" The sudden call of her name jolted Layla from her thoughts. Her heart raced as every eye in the room turned toward her. She blinked at the board, where a complicated math problem loomed, the numbers and symbols blurring together. The class erupted into hushed giggles. Layla's cheeks burned hot as she tried to collect herself. The mocking tone in Mrs. Cromwell's voice didn't feel like a teacher trying to guide a struggling student. It felt personal, deliberate, like a trap set to humiliate her. Layla stammered, her voice barely audible. She clutched her pencil tightly, her knuckles white with tension. Mrs. Cromwell's lips curled into a smirk. "Didn't think so," she said, shaking her head as if Layla's failure was expected. "Maybe next time, try paying attention." Or, she added with a raised eyebrow, "would you prefer I ask something simpler?" This time, the laughter wasn't just giggles. It rolled through the room in waves, loud and unrelenting. Layla's stomach twisted as the sound washed over her. She wanted to disappear, to sink into the floor and vanish. But amidst the laughter, Layla caught glimpses of hesitation. A few classmates exchanged uneasy glances, their faces betraying a flicker of discomfort. They didn't agree with Mrs. Cromwell's behavior, but they didn't say anything, either. Mrs. Cromwell turned back to the board, her dismissal of Layla complete. "As I was saying," she began, resuming her lecture as though nothing had happened. Layla stared at her desk, her vision blurred with unshed tears. She couldn't bring herself to look up, not at the teacher, not at her classmates. Her mother's words echoed faintly in her mind, "People will always show you who they are, don't let it shake you." But right now, those words felt distant and unreachable. The rest of the lesson dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity. Layla tried to focus on the material, to lose herself in the rhythm of taking notes, but her mind kept replaying the scene. Mrs. Cromwell's sneer, the laughter, the way her own voice had trembled as she tried to respond, it all circled in her head like a storm she couldn't escape. Finally, the bell rang, and Layla exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She packed her things quickly, keeping her head down as she slipped out of the classroom. But Mrs. Cromwell wasn't finished with her. "Layla," the teacher called, her voice firm and unyielding. Layla froze in the hallway, her hand clutching the strap of her backpack. Slowly, she turned back to face Mrs. Cromwell, who stood in the doorway with her arms crossed. "Yes, ma'am," Layla said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Cromwell's expression was unreadable, but her tone was sharp. "I suggest you start taking your education more seriously. If you keep this up, you won't amount to much." The words hit Layla like a punch to the gut. She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Her throat felt tight, and her chest ached with the effort of holding back tears. "I'll see you tomorrow," Mrs. Cromwell said briskly before turning back into the classroom. Layla stood there for a moment, stunned. The hallway buzzed with the chatter of students rushing to their next classes, but she felt like she was standing still in a world that had moved on without her. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Layla went through the motions, attending her classes and taking notes, but her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't shake the weight of Mrs. Cromwell's words or the humiliation of that morning. By lunchtime, Layla found herself sitting alone at a corner table in the cafeteria, as she often did. She poked at her sandwich, her appetite gone, and let her thoughts spiral. Why did Mrs. Cromwell seem to single her out? Why did the teacher's words always feel like they were meant to cut deeper than necessary? Layla had tried to ignore it, to convince herself that she was imagining things, but today had confirmed it. Mrs. Cromwell didn't just dislike her, she wanted to tear her down. Across the cafeteria, Layla noticed a group of students from her class laughing and chatting. Chloe Adams, the class star, was in the center of the group, her voice carrying above the others. Layla watched as Chloe mimicked Mrs. Cromwell's stern expression, her words exaggerated in a cruel impersonation. "Maybe I should ask something Simpler, Chloe said, her tone dripping with mockery. The table erupted in laughter. Layla's face burned as she realized they were talking about her. She quickly looked down, pretending not to notice, but the damage was already done. The rest of the school day felt like a blur. Layla moved through the halls like a ghost, her presence unnoticed and her spirits low. By the time the final bell rang, she was exhausted not from the lessons, but from the constant effort of holding herself together. As Layla walked home, her thoughts churned. She replayed Mrs. Cromwell's words over and over, each one stinging as much as it had in the moment. When she reached her house, her mother was waiting for her on the porch. "Hey, sweetheart," her mother said, her voice warm and welcoming. Layla managed a small smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Her mother noticed immediately. "What happened?" her mother asked gently, stepping forward to pull her into a hug. Layla hesitated, then let the words tumble out. She told her mother everything about Mrs. Cromwell's sharp words, the laughter of her classmates, and the way it felt like no one cared enough to stand up for her. Her mother listened intently, her expression calm but her eyes blazing with a protective fire. When Layla finished, her mother placed a hand on her shoulder. "Layla, listen to me," she said firmly. "You are worth so much more than the way that woman treats you. Do you hear me?" Layla nodded, but her doubts lingered. "And as for Mrs. Cromwell," her mother continued, her voice steady and determined, "I'm going to handle this. No one has the right to tear you down like that, not a teacher, not anyone." Layla's heart swelled with a mix of relief and apprehension. She wasn't sure what her mother planned to do, but for the first time that day, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe things would change. Maybe someone would finally stand up for her. That night, as Layla lay in bed, she thought about her mother's words. The unfairness of Mrs. Cromwell's treatment still stung, but for the first time, it didn't feel like a weight she had to carry alone. Tomorrow, she thought, will be different. It has to be. As Layla lay in bed that night, her mind refused to quiet. The memory of Mrs. Cromwell's smirk and the laughter of her classmates echoed in her thoughts, but so did her mother's reassuring words. Despite the day's sting, a small ember of hope flickered within her. She couldn't shake the feeling that her mother's involvement might finally bring some long-awaited change. The next morning arrived too soon. Layla woke to the sound of her mother bustling around the kitchen, the comforting aroma of pancakes wafting through the air. She trudged downstairs, her backpack slung over her shoulder, her face still heavy with the weight of yesterday. Her mother greeted her with a warm smile, sliding a plate of pancakes onto the table. "Good morning, sweetheart. I figured you could use a good breakfast today." Layla hesitated before sitting down. "Mom, you're not really going to say something to Mrs. Cromwell, are you?" Her mother looked at her, her expression a mix of kindness and resolve. "Layla, what's happening to you in that classroom isn't right. I can't just sit back and do nothing." "But what if it makes things worse?" Layla asked, her voice tinged with worry. Her mother placed a comforting hand over hers. "Sometimes, standing up for yourself or having someone stand up for you feels scary. But it's important. Trust me, okay?" Layla nodded reluctantly, her appetite returning as she nibbled on the pancakes. She didn't feel entirely convinced, but she also knew her mother's determination wasn't easily swayed. The school day began like any other, with students milling about in the hallways and the sharp ring of the morning bell signaling the start of class. Layla walked into Mrs. Cromwell's classroom with her usual mix of dread and resignation. She took her seat quietly, her head low, as Mrs. Cromwell strode into the room, her heels clicking sharply against the tile floor. "Settle down, everyone," Mrs. Cromwell commanded, her tone as crisp and cold as ever. She began the lesson without so much as a glance in Layla's direction, but the tension in the air felt heavier than usual. Layla couldn't help but wonder if her mother's planned conversation with the teacher had already taken place. As the lesson progressed, Layla tried her best to focus, taking notes diligently and avoiding eye contact with anyone around her. But her reprieve was short-lived. "Layla," Mrs. Cromwell called out suddenly, her voice cutting through the hum of the classroom. "Let's see if you can redeem yourself today. Can you answer this question, or is it another too difficult moment?" Layla felt her stomach drop. She glanced at the board, where a complicated algebra equation was displayed. She swallowed hard, her palms sweating as she struggled to work through the problem in her mind. The silence in the room was deafening, and she could feel the weight of her classmates' stares. I think it's," Layla began, her voice faltering. Mrs. Cromwell crossed her arms, an eyebrow raised. "Spit it out, Layla. We don't have all day." Before Layla could finish, the classroom door opened. Everyone turned to see who had interrupted, and Layla's heart skipped a beat when she saw her mother standing in the doorway. Her presence was calm but commanding, her eyes scanning the room before settling on Mrs. Cromwell. "Mrs. Cromwell," Layla's mother said, her voice steady and polite but firm. "May I have a word with you?" Mrs. Cromwell blinked, clearly caught off guard. She hesitated before nodding curtly. "Class, work on the practice problems in your textbook. I'll be back shortly." The teacher followed Layla's mother into the hallway, closing the door behind them. The classroom buzzed with whispered speculation, but Layla felt frozen in her seat. She couldn't hear what was being said, but the mere fact that her mother was confronting Mrs. Cromwell filled her with a mix of nervousness and relief. Outside the classroom, Layla's mother wasted no time. "Mrs. Cromwell, I'm here because I'm deeply concerned about how you've been treating my daughter," she began, her tone unwavering. "I'm sorry, but I don't believe I understand," Mrs. Cromwell replied, her voice clipped. "I think you do," Layla's mother countered. "Singling her out, belittling her in front of her classmates, setting her up to fail, these aren't the actions of a teacher trying to help a student succeed. They're the actions of someone trying to tear a child down. And that's unacceptable." Mrs. Cromwell bristled. "With all due respect, Mrs. Johnson, I treat all my students the same." Layla's mother raised an eyebrow. "Do you? Because from what I've heard, your interactions with Layla suggest otherwise. A teacher's job is to educate and inspire, not to crush a student's confidence." Mrs. Cromwell opened her mouth to respond but seemed to think better of it. She looked away, her expression tight. "I'm not here to argue," Layla's mother continued. "I'm here to make it clear that this behavior stops now. Layla deserves the same respect and support as every other student in this school. If there's a problem, you address it constructively. You don't demean her." Mrs. Cromwell nodded stiffly. "I understand. I hope you do," Layla's mother said. "Because if this continues, I won't hesitate to escalate this matter to the principal or the school board." Without waiting for a response, Layla's mother turned and walked back down the hallway, her steps confident and deliberate. When Mrs. Cromwell returned to the classroom, her expression was unreadable. She resumed the lesson without acknowledging what had just transpired, but Layla noticed something different in her demeanor. Her sharp edges seemed slightly dulled, her tone less biting. For the rest of the day, Layla couldn't stop thinking about her mother's intervention. Part of her felt embarrassed that her mother had stepped in, but a larger part of her felt a sense of vindication. Someone had finally stood up for her, and it felt like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Over the next few weeks, Layla noticed subtle changes in Mrs. Cromwell's behavior. The teacher still called on her occasionally, but her tone lacked its usual sting. The sarcastic remarks and cutting comments stopped altogether. Layla wasn't sure if the change was genuine or merely an effort to avoid further confrontation, but either way, it made a difference. For the first time in a long time, Layla began to feel a sense of belonging in the classroom. Her confidence grew slowly but steadily, and she started participating more in lessons. She even managed to answer a few questions correctly, earning nods of approval from Mrs. Cromwell that felt surprisingly genuine. Outside of school, Layla's mother continued to encourage her, reminding her of her worth and potential. "Remember," she would say, "you have every right to be here, and no one can take that away from you." Those words stayed with Layla, becoming a mantra she repeated to herself whenever doubt crept in. She began to hold her head a little higher, her shoulders a little straighter. And though the scars of Mrs. Cromwell's earlier treatment would take time to heal, Layla knew she was stronger now, stronger than she had ever been. One day, as Layla sat in class, Mrs. Cromwell approached her desk. "Layla," she said, her tone uncharacteristically soft, "I wanted to let you know that your last assignment was excellent. Keep up the good work." Layla looked up, surprised. The compliment felt awkward but sincere, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something almost human in Mrs. Cromwell's eyes. "Thank you," Layla said quietly, a small smile tugging at her lips. And as the lesson continued, Layla felt a sense of hope she hadn't felt before. Change was slow, but it was possible. And for the first time, she believed things could truly get better. In the days that followed her mother's confrontation with Mrs. Cromwell, Layla felt as if she were walking a tightrope. Mrs. Cromwell was quieter, less openly hostile, but the tension hadn't disappeared, it had simply shifted. Layla could feel the teacher's disdain simmering beneath the surface, waiting to erupt. Instead of the usual open taunts, Mrs. Cromwell's tactics became subtler but no less cutting. She would mark Layla's assignments with overly critical comments, often ignoring the same mistakes in other students' work. When dividing the class into groups for a project, Mrs. Cromwell made sure to assign Layla to work alone, announcing it with a cold, almost gleeful tone. "Layla, since you seem to have difficulty contributing in group settings, I think it's best you work independently this time. Let's see if you can manage without dragging anyone else down." Layla swallowed hard, her face flushing as the class turned to look at her. A few students exchanged uncomfortable glances, and one boy raised his hand as if to protest, but he quickly lowered it when Mrs. Cromwell's sharp gaze swept the room. Still, Layla didn't argue. She bit her lip, sat straighter in her seat, and began taking notes for the project on her own. Mrs. Cromwell's words stung, but Layla had her mother's advice in her heart: "People will always show you who they are, don't let it shake you." Layla's quiet determination began to catch the attention of her classmates. At first, they were hesitant, unsure of how to react to Mrs. Cromwell's behavior or Layla's growing resilience. But slowly, small gestures of support began to emerge. One day, as Layla struggled to carry an armful of books to the library, a girl named Jenna hurried over to help. "Here, let me take some," she said with a shy smile. "Thanks," Layla replied, surprised but grateful. Another time, during a particularly challenging math lesson, a boy named Caleb slid his notebook over to Layla's desk, showing her how he'd worked through the problem. "You're doing it right," he whispered. "Just double-check this step." These moments were small but significant. They chipped away at the isolation Layla had felt for so long, and they hinted at a quiet shift among her peers. One afternoon, while Layla was gathering her things after class, she overheard a conversation between two teachers in the hallway. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but the sound of her mother's name stopped her in her tracks. "I heard Dr. Naomi Johnson is her mother," one teacher said, her voice low. "Really?" the other replied, sounding surprised. "I didn't know. No wonder she's so composed. Runs in the family, I suppose." Layla's heart skipped a beat. What were they talking about? She knew her mother was respected in her field. She'd seen the framed certificates and awards lining the walls of their home office, but she had never considered that her mother's reputation might extend into her school life. As the teachers walked away, Layla tucked the thought into the back of her mind. She didn't fully understand its significance yet, but it lingered like a puzzle piece waiting to find its place. A week later, an unexpected visitor arrived in Mrs. Cromwell's classroom. As the students worked silently on a reading assignment, the principal, Mr. Grayson, stepped in. He exchanged pleasantries with Mrs. Cromwell, but his demeanor was noticeably serious. "I'd like to observe for a few minutes, if that's all right," he said. "Of course," Mrs. Cromwell replied, her smile tight. Mr. Grayson stood at the back of the room, watching intently as Mrs. Cromwell conducted the lesson. Layla couldn't help but feel his gaze linger on her a little longer than on anyone else. She focused on her work, her pencil moving steadily across the page, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was unfolding. After the lesson, Mr. Grayson asked Mrs. Cromwell to step into the hallway for a brief conversation. The class buzzed with curiosity, but Layla kept her head down, pretending not to notice. When Mrs. Cromwell returned, her face was pale, and her movements were stiffer than usual. She resumed the lesson without her usual sharpness, and for the first time, Layla felt a small sense of power shift in her favor. Over the next few days, more hints began to surface. During lunch, Jenna leaned across the table toward Layla. "Is it true your mom's, like, super important?" Jenna asked, her voice low. Layla blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" "I heard some teachers talking," Jenna said. "They said your mom is Dr. Naomi Johnson, the one who's been on TV and stuff. Is that true?" Layla hesitated. She didn't know how much to say. "She's a doctor, yeah," she replied carefully. Jenna's eyes widened. "That's so cool. My mom says your mom is, like, a big deal in education or something." Layla shrugged, trying to downplay it. "She works hard, that's all." But Jenna's words stayed with her. She'd always known her mother was exceptional, but hearing it framed this way made her realize just how much influence her mother might have not just at home, but in the world beyond. Mrs. Cromwell's behavior continued to change, though it wasn't entirely clear why. She no longer singled Layla out as often, and when she did, her tone lacked its usual venom. One afternoon, as Layla turned in an essay, Mrs. Cromwell glanced at her and said, "Good work on the last assignment, Layla. I can see you're improving." The words were simple, but they carried a weight Layla hadn't expected. She didn't trust the sentiment entirely, but it was a crack in the wall Mrs. Cromwell had built between them, a small sign that things might be shifting. Late one night, Layla sat with her mother in their living room, the glow of a single lamp casting soft light across the room. Her mother was reviewing papers for work, her glasses perched on the edge of her nose. "Mom," Layla began hesitantly, "why do people at school know who you are?" Her mother looked up, surprised by the question. "What do you mean?" "Jenna said some teachers were talking about you. She said you're kind of a big deal." Her mother chuckled softly. "Well, I've done some work in education reform. I've spoken at a few conferences and written some articles." "But why is that coming up at your school?" "I don't know," Layla admitted. "But I think it's why the principal came to my class. And why Mrs. Cromwell is acting different." Her mother's expression grew serious. "Layla, you're my priority. If my work is helping to make things better for you, then I'm glad. But I also want you to know that you're strong enough to face these challenges on your own." Layla nodded, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. She still didn't fully understand the extent of her mother's influence, but she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't alone in this fight. And as the pieces of the puzzle slowly came together, Layla began to sense that a much larger revelation was on the horizon, one that would change everything. The days passed, and Layla began noticing even more small but telling changes. Classmates who had once stayed silent in the face of Mrs. Cromwell's cruelty now offered her quiet support. Jenna often sat beside her during lunch, striking up casual conversations that made Layla feel a little less isolated. Caleb, the boy who had shown her his math notes, started partnering with her during class activities, despite Mrs. Cromwell's attempts to keep her working alone. And then there were the teachers. They no longer avoided eye contact with Layla in the hallways. Instead, some even smiled or offered brief words of encouragement. One day, her history teacher, Mr. Patel, stopped her after class. "Layla," he said gently, "I just want you to know you're doing a great job. Don't let anyone make you think otherwise." Layla blinked in surprise. "Thank you," she murmured, feeling a lump rise in her throat. Mr. Patel gave her a kind smile before turning to his next task, leaving Layla with a strange mixture of emotions, gratitude, confusion, and a faint sense of hope. Despite these shifts, Mrs. Cromwell wasn't one to let go of her control easily. Her resentment toward Layla simmered beneath the surface, manifesting in subtle but deliberate ways. When Layla turned in her independent project a detailed report on the cultural history of the Harlem Renaissance, Mrs. Cromwell barely glanced at it before marking it with a red pen. "This is adequate," she said, her tone clipped. Layla's heart sank as she read the word adequate scrawled across the top of her paper. She had poured her heart into the project, spending late nights researching and revising. But instead of breaking down, Layla took a deep breath and straightened her shoulders. "Excuse me, Mrs. Cromwell," she said, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "Could you explain what I could improve? I want to do better." Mrs. Cromwell's eyes narrowed. It was clear she hadn't expected Layla to challenge her. "The work is fine, Layla," she replied, her tone dismissive. "But fine isn't exceptional, is it?" Layla nodded slowly. "I understand. Thank you for the feedback." She returned to her seat, ignoring the smirk that tugged at Mrs. Cromwell's lips. Layla might not have won this battle, but she was determined not to let it define her. By now, the whispers about Layla's mother had spread beyond the teacher's lounge. Students began piecing together fragments of conversations they had overheard, and Layla found herself at the center of a quiet storm of curiosity. "Is it true your mom's on the school board?" one girl asked as they waited in line for lunch. "She's not just on the board," another boy chimed in. "I heard she's, like, in charge of education stuff for the whole state." Layla felt her cheeks heat up under their scrutiny. "She works in education, that's all," she said simply, hoping to deflect their attention. But the rumors only grew. By the end of the week, even the older students were talking about her. "That's Layla," one senior whispered to her friend in the hallway. "Her mom's the one who got that big grant for the school district last year." Layla pretended not to hear, but a part of her couldn't help but wonder, how much did Mrs. Cromwell know? And how would she react if she found out the full truth? The pieces of the puzzle finally began to fall into place during a school assembly. The principal, Mr. Grayson, stood on the stage, addressing the student body about the importance of equity and respect in education. "Today, we're fortunate to have a special guest who has dedicated her career to ensuring that all students have access to quality education," Mr. Grayson announced. "Please join me in welcoming Dr. Naomi Johnson." Layla froze as her mother stepped onto the stage, her presence commanding yet warm. The applause was polite but tinged with curiosity. Layla's classmates turned to look at her, their expressions ranging from awe to confusion. Jenna leaned over and whispered, "Your mom's amazing." Mrs. Cromwell, however, looked as if she had swallowed a lemon. Her usually composed expression cracked, revealing a mixture of shock and unease. As Dr. Johnson spoke about the importance of inclusivity and the power of resilience, Layla felt a swell of pride. Her mother's words resonated deeply, not just with the audience but with Layla herself. "Sometimes, the greatest strength lies in quiet persistence," Dr. Johnson said, her gaze sweeping the room. "And sometimes, the ones who are underestimated are the ones who will rise the highest." The students erupted in applause, and Layla found herself blinking back tears. For the first time, she felt truly seen, not just as a target of Mrs. Cromwell's prejudice, but as someone with a voice and a story of her own. In the days following the assembly, Mrs. Cromwell's grip on her authority began to slip. Her attempts to belittle Layla were met with icy silence from the class, and even her colleagues seemed to distance themselves. One afternoon, Mr. Grayson called Layla to his office. She entered nervously, unsure of what to expect. "I wanted to commend you," he said, his tone warm. "You've handled yourself with remarkable grace. And I want you to know that we're taking steps to address some issues within the faculty." Layla nodded, understanding the unspoken words. As Layla walked back to class, she felt a newfound sense of purpose. The pieces were falling into place, and she knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light, not just about her mother's influence, but about her own quiet strength. And as Mrs. Cromwell avoided her gaze that afternoon, Layla couldn't help but smile. The storm was far from over, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it head-on. The room fell into a stunned silence. Every student turned their attention to the woman standing in the doorway, Dr. Naomi Johnson, whose poised demeanor radiated authority. Layla's mother carried herself with an air of quiet confidence, her gaze steady as it locked onto Mrs. Cromwell. Layla stood frozen at the front of the class, chalk still in hand, her heart pounding. She had imagined her mother confronting Mrs. Cromwell before, but never like this. Mrs. Cromwell fidgeted with the edge of her desk, clearly thrown off balance. "Dr. Johnson," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I wasn't expecting a visit." Dr. Johnson stepped into the room, her heels clicking softly against the floor, each step deliberate and calculated. "I'm sure you weren't," she said, her voice smooth and even. "But I've been hearing a lot about how you've been treating my daughter, and I decided it was time we addressed it." The tension in the room was palpable. Students exchanged wide-eyed glances, barely daring to breathe. Mrs. Cromwell straightened her posture, attempting to regain her composure. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," she said, her tone defensive. "I treat all my students equally." Dr. Johnson tilted her head slightly, a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes playing on her lips. "Equally," she repeated. "Is that what you call singling out my daughter for humiliation? Dismissing her contributions? Undermining her confidence at every turn?" Mrs. Cromwell flushed, her words faltering. I only hold my students to high standards. Layla struggles to meet them." At this, Dr. Johnson's calm exterior cracked, replaced by a steely determination. "You don't hold Layla to high standards, Mrs. Cromwell. You hold her to a different standard. A lower one. You've made her feel like she doesn't belong, and that is unacceptable." The weight of Dr. Johnson's words hung in the air. Mrs. Cromwell opened her mouth as if to argue but found no response. Dr. Johnson turned to the class, her voice softening but remaining firm. "I want all of you to hear this because it's important. No one deserves to be made to feel less than, whether it's because of their race, their background, or anything else. And sometimes, standing up for yourself means calling out the behavior that tries to keep you down." Layla felt a surge of emotion rise in her chest. For so long, she had endured Mrs. Cromwell's treatment in silence, believing she had no choice. But here was her mother, standing before the entire class, giving voice to everything Layla had wanted to say. Mrs. Cromwell's jaw tightened. "I'm sorry if Layla felt that way," she said stiffly. "But I assure you, my intentions—" "Your intentions don't matter as much as your actions," Dr. Johnson interrupted, her tone unwavering. "This isn't just about Layla. It's about every student in this room who has seen how you treat her and wondered if they might be next." For a moment, silence enveloped the room. Then, to everyone's surprise, Layla stepped forward. "Mom," she began, her voice trembling but clear, I want to say something." Dr. Johnson stepped back, her expression softening as she nodded. "Go ahead, sweetheart." Layla turned to face the class, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt their eyes on her, some curious, some supportive, some unsure. Taking a deep breath, she began to speak. "All my life, my mom has taught me to stand up for what's right. She's told me that people will show you who they are and that it's up to you to decide how to respond. I let myself believe that staying quiet was the best response, but it's not." She turned to Mrs. Cromwell, meeting her gaze for the first time without fear. "You've made me feel like I wasn't good enough. You've embarrassed me in front of my classmates, doubted my abilities, and ignored the effort I put into my work. But I know now that your words don't define me. And they never will again." A murmur rippled through the class. Caleb nodded subtly, Jenna gave her a thumbs up, and even a few of the quieter students looked on with admiration. Dr. Johnson placed a gentle hand on Layla's shoulder, her pride evident. "Thank you, Layla," she said. Then, she turned back to Mrs. Cromwell. "I hope you've been paying attention, because this is the strength you've underestimated. Layla isn't just a student, she's a young woman with potential, intelligence, and resilience. And whether you recognize it or not, she deserves the same respect as anyone else in this classroom." Mrs. Cromwell looked as though she might argue, but the weight of the moment and the eyes of the class left her silent. Dr. Johnson addressed the class once more. "This is a lesson for all of us. Speak up when you see injustice. Support one another. And never let anyone make you feel like you don't belong." After Dr. Johnson left, the room remained quiet. Mrs. Cromwell, visibly shaken, dismissed the class early, unable to regain her usual composure. Over the next few weeks, the school administration launched an investigation into Mrs. Cromwell's behavior. The principal met with students, staff, and parents, ensuring that changes would be made to create a more inclusive and supportive environment. As for Layla, she walked through the halls with her head held high. Her classmates treated her with newfound respect, and even those who had once laughed at Mrs. Cromwell's taunts now offered smiles and friendly greetings. One day, as Layla packed up her things after class, Jenna approached her. "You were amazing that day," Jenna said. "I don't think I could have done it." Layla smiled. "You could if you had to," she replied. "Sometimes, standing up is the only choice." Jenna nodded thoughtfully, then added, "Your mom is incredible, too." "She is," Layla agreed. "But she taught me that I can be, too." And as she walked out of the classroom, sunlight streaming through the windows, Layla felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. In the days following Dr. Johnson's visit, the school felt different. Whispers of the confrontation between Mrs. Cromwell and Layla's mother spread quickly, reaching not just students but staff and parents as well. It was as though a spotlight had been cast on the injustices that had simmered beneath the surface for too long. Some students, emboldened by Layla's courage, began to share their own stories. Jenna spoke up in history class about how she had always felt overshadowed by the more outspoken students. Caleb admitted during a group discussion that he often hesitated to contribute because he feared judgment. Layla found herself at the center of something bigger than she had imagined. Her classmates didn't just see her as the quiet girl anymore. They saw her as someone who had stood up not only for herself but for all of them. One afternoon, Layla was called to the principal's office. She felt a familiar knot tighten in her stomach as she walked down the hallway, but this time, there was no dread, only curiosity. Mr. Grayson greeted her with a kind smile. "Layla, thank you for coming. Please, have a seat." She sat down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Am I in trouble?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. "Not at all," Mr. Grayson assured her. "In fact, I wanted to commend you. What you and your mother did took incredible bravery. It's not easy to speak out, especially against someone in a position of authority." Layla nodded, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and relief. "We're conducting a thorough review of Mrs. Cromwell's behavior," Mr. Grayson continued. "Several students have come forward with similar concerns, and we're taking steps to ensure this kind of behavior isn't tolerated in our school." Layla hesitated before speaking. "Will she still be teaching here?" Mr. Grayson sighed, leaning back in his chair. "That decision hasn't been made yet, but I can promise you this, things are going to change. And Layla, if there's ever anything you need, my door is always open." "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Meanwhile, Mrs. Cromwell was feeling the full weight of the consequences. For years, she had operated under the belief that her authority would never be questioned. She had convinced herself that her methods were tough love, that her sharp criticisms were necessary to prepare students for the real world. But now, as she sat alone in her classroom after hours, the empty desk seemed to mock her. She replayed Dr. Johnson's words in her mind, "Ignorance is no excuse for prejudice." For the first time, Mrs. Cromwell began to question her actions. Had she really been helping her students, or had she been tearing them down? And why had she singled out Layla? A knock on the door startled her. She looked up to see Mr. Patel, the history teacher, standing in the doorway. "Mind if I come in?" he asked. Mrs. Cromwell nodded, gesturing for him to sit. "I heard about what happened," Mr. Patel said gently. "Tough day." Mrs. Cromwell sighed. "Tough doesn't begin to cover it." Mr. Patel studied her for a moment before speaking. "You know, I've been teaching here for a long time, and I've seen how you run your classroom. You're a talented educator, but maybe it's time to reevaluate how you connect with your students." Her defenses rose instinctively, but she forced herself to listen. "They don't just need knowledge, Evelyn," Mr. Patel continued. "They need encouragement. Respect. Someone who believes in them, even when they don't believe in themselves." Mrs. Cromwell nodded slowly, his words hitting her harder than she expected. For Layla, life at school began to improve. The weight she had carried for so long was finally starting to lift. She no longer felt invisible or insignificant, her voice had been heard, and it mattered. Her classmates treated her differently now, not with pity, but with respect. Caleb often asked for her input during group projects, and Jenna invited her to sit with her friends at lunch. But the biggest change was within Layla herself. She walked with her head held high, no longer afraid to speak up when she had something to say. One day, during English class, the teacher asked for volunteers to read their essays aloud. Layla's hand shot up before she could second-guess herself. As she read her essay about resilience and finding one's voice, the room was silent. When she finished, the class erupted into applause. Mrs. Cromwell, who had been sitting in the back of the room as an observer, watched with a mixture of awe and regret. Weeks later, the school announced that Mrs. Cromwell would be stepping away from her teaching position. The news was met with a range of reactions. Some students were relieved, while others were simply curious about what would happen next. For Layla, it marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Dr. Johnson continued to play an active role in the school community, hosting workshops for teachers and parents on creating inclusive environments. She often invited Layla to join her, encouraging her to share her story. One evening, after a particularly moving workshop, Dr. Johnson turned to Layla. "You know, your story has the power to inspire so many people," she said. Layla smiled. "I never thought I'd be someone people looked up to." "You've always had it in you," her mother replied. "You just needed the right moment to show it." And as they walked out into the crisp evening air, Layla felt a sense of purpose she had never known before. Her journey wasn't just about standing up for herself, it was about showing others that they could, too. The impact of Layla's courage didn't stop at the school. Her story became a catalyst for change throughout the district. Policies were revised, Teachers received additional training, and students were given platforms to share their voices. Layla often thought back to her mother's words, "People will always show you who they are, don't let it shake you." She had seen the truth in those words, and now she carried them with her, a reminder of how far she had come and how much further she could go. For Layla Johnson, the quiet girl who had once tried to stay invisible, the future was bright. She wasn't just a student anymore. She was a leader, a fighter, and a beacon of hope for those who needed it most. By the end of the week, Layla could hardly believe the changes that had happened. Mrs. Cromwell had been placed on administrative leave while the school conducted a full investigation into her actions. It wasn't just the students who had complained, there had been reports from staff members who had noticed her behavior as well. The school couldn't ignore what had been going on anymore. On Monday morning, the principal, Mr. Grayson, addressed the entire school during a special assembly. He stood at the front of the room, his usual calm and composed demeanor slightly more serious than usual. "Students, teachers, and staff," he began, his voice echoing through the quiet room. "I want to acknowledge the recent events involving one of our staff members. As you all know, we hold ourselves to a standard of respect, fairness, and inclusivity here at this school. Any behavior that falls short of these standards will be addressed. Mrs. Cromwell is currently on administrative leave while an investigation takes place." Layla sat in the middle of the room, her back straight, her hands folded neatly on her lap. She could feel the eyes of her classmates on her, but this time, she didn't shrink away. She sat up taller, knowing that the decision to stand up for herself had already changed the course of her life. Mr. Grayson continued, "I want to also take this opportunity to apologize to Layla Johnson and to every student who has ever felt unseen, unheard, or disrespected. We are committed to making sure that this kind of behavior never happens again. We will be working hard to ensure our school is a place where all students are treated with the dignity they deserve." The room was silent for a moment before a few students clapped. Layla could feel the shift, things were changing. The following day, Layla walked into class with a quiet confidence. She could hear whispers as she passed through the door, but these weren't the mocking whispers she had once dreaded. They were different, some were curious, some were admiring. The same students who had once joined in the laughter at her expense now avoided her gaze, unsure of how to act around her. Layla didn't mind. She had learned that the opinions of those who didn't truly know her didn't matter. What mattered was how she saw herself. And right now, she saw a young woman who had stood up for herself and fought for respect. She felt a sense of power that she had never known before. Her desk was in the same spot as before, but today it felt different. Layla felt in control. She didn't shrink into her chair, hoping to disappear. She sat tall, ready to face whatever came her way. No one dared to mock her anymore. As the bell rang and the class settled down, Mrs. Cromwell's absence hung in the air. The students spoke in hushed tones, but Layla focused on the lesson. There was a new sense of respect in the room, one that she hadn't seen before. It wasn't just because Mrs. Cromwell was no longer there. It was because something had changed in the way the students saw Layla and in the way they saw each other. In the following weeks, Layla noticed even more changes. Teachers began to check in more with their students, making sure everyone felt included. There were discussions about the importance of diversity, respect, and kindness in the classroom. Workshops were organized for both students and teachers, focusing on building empathy and understanding. The entire school seemed to be evolving into a more supportive and open community. Layla's friends started to speak up more, too. Jenna, who had always been a little quiet herself, began voicing her opinions in class discussions. Caleb, who had always been quick to follow the crowd, started challenging his friends when he noticed them making jokes at someone's expense. Even the quieter students, those who had never spoken up before, seemed to find their voices. The entire atmosphere in the school had shifted, and Layla couldn't help but feel proud that her courage had played a part in that change. One afternoon, Layla found herself standing in front of Mrs. Cromwell's classroom. She had never imagined she would be here like this, but something inside her told her it was time to see it through. The door was slightly ajar, and she could hear the sound of someone talking inside. She hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open, stepping inside. The classroom was empty, except for Mrs. Cromwell, who was sitting at her desk, her hands clasped in front of her. She looked up in surprise, as if she hadn't expected anyone to come. Her face was pale, her eyes tired. "Layla," Mrs. Cromwell said, her voice soft. "I didn't think you'd come." Layla stood tall, her heart steady in her chest. "I came because I need to say something," she replied, her voice strong. "I'm not here to yell or argue. But I want you to know that what you did to me wasn't okay. You made me feel worthless. You made me believe that I wasn't enough. And for a long time, I let you. But now, I know that none of that was true." Mrs. Cromwell looked down, her hands shaking slightly. I never meant to hurt you. I thought I was pushing you to be better." "You pushed me, all right," Layla said. "But it wasn't to be better. It was to make me feel small. And I'm not small. I never was." For a long moment, Mrs. Cromwell said nothing. She simply sat there, staring at Layla, her expression unreadable. Then, quietly, she nodded. "I'm sorry, Layla," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't see it. I didn't understand. But I do now." Layla gave a small nod, her heart surprisingly calm. "I don't expect you to fix everything, but I hope you take this lesson seriously. People deserve to be treated with respect, no matter who they are." The next few days felt like a new chapter. Layla no longer felt like the girl hiding in the back of the class, hoping to avoid attention. She was now someone who stood tall, unafraid to face what came her way. Her classmates, who had once been passive observers, now looked at her with a sense of admiration. They respected her, not just for the stand she had taken but for the dignity with which she carried herself. Even the teachers seemed different, more aware of the dynamics in their classrooms. Layla had always known that the world wasn't fair, but now she understood that sometimes, standing up for what's right could bring about change. Her mother's words echoed in her mind, "People will always show you who they are. And when they do, you have the choice to rise above it." Layla had risen. And in doing so, she had not only reclaimed her dignity but had helped others do the same. The day came when Mrs. Cromwell was no longer part of the school. Her resignation was formalized, and the decision to part ways was met with mixed reactions. Some students were relieved, while others were simply curious about the changes that would come next. For Layla, however, the departure of Mrs. Cromwell didn't feel like a victory, it felt like closure. She had already won the real battle. She had reclaimed her own sense of worth and had earned the respect of those around her. As the school year progressed, Layla's reputation as a strong, courageous student continued to grow. But even more importantly, she had grown. She had become a person who understood that standing up for herself wasn't just about protecting her own dignity, it was about setting an example for others. And as she walked through the halls with her head held high, Layla knew that no matter what happened in the future, she had learned one of life's most important lessons: never let anyone make you feel less than you are. Layla sat quietly by her window, watching the world move on outside. The sun was setting, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and orange, and for the first time in a long while, Layla felt a sense of peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that comes from avoiding challenges or pretending everything was fine, it was the kind of peace that comes from knowing that you've fought for what's right, and you've come out stronger on the other side. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind. She had faced adversity in a way she never imagined, yet she had emerged not just unbroken, but more whole than before. Every difficult moment, every cruel word from Mrs. Cromwell, every taunting glance from her classmates had only sharpened her resolve. Layla had learned that real strength wasn't about fighting back with anger. It wasn't about making noise or demanding attention. Real strength came from knowing who you are, from holding onto your dignity even when the world around you seemed determined to strip it away. Layla didn't need to prove herself to anyone. She had already done that in ways that mattered. She had stood tall, she had spoken out, and she had remained true to herself even in the face of cruelty. What Mrs. Cromwell hadn't known, what none of the students had known, was that Layla had always been more than the quiet girl sitting in the back of the room. She had always been more than the label that others had tried to put on her. She had been strong all along. The strength hadn't come from her loudness or her ability to fight back. It had come from her ability to stay grounded and silent in the face of mockery, from her quiet determination to never let anyone define her. Layla thought about her mother's words, the ones she had repeated over and over when Layla felt like giving up: people will always show you who they are. And when they do, you have the choice to rise above it. Those words had kept her going when it felt like no one was on her side. They had reminded her that while she couldn't control the actions of others, she could control how she responded. And responding with grace, with strength, was a choice. Layla had chosen to rise above. She had chosen not to let Mrs. Cromwell's harsh words or her classmates' indifference define her. And in doing so, she had gained something far more valuable than any momentary victory. She had gained the respect of her peers, and most importantly, she had gained her own respect. Strength doesn't always come from being loud or fighting back with fire. Sometimes, strength is about keeping your head high in the face of injustice. Sometimes, strength is about listening instead of reacting, about holding onto your truth even when others try to pull you away from it. Layla understood that now. She didn't need to fight with her fists or with harsh words. She fought with her silence, with her quiet determination to never let anyone convince her she was less than she was. And as she thought back to that day when Mrs. Cromwell had stood in front of the class, dismissing her with cruel words, Layla realized something important. Mrs. Cromwell had underestimated her. She had looked at Layla and saw someone who was quiet, who was perhaps invisible. But what Mrs. Cromwell didn't realize was that Layla was the opposite of invisible. She was strong in her silence. And when the time came, Layla had shown her power. She had shown that even the quietest person could make waves. And what about Mrs. Cromwell? She had learned the hard way. The world didn't always bend to those with the loudest voices or the harshest words. Mrs. Cromwell had underestimated Layla in every way. She had assumed that because Layla didn't argue, because she didn't fight back, she was weak. But that couldn't have been further from the truth. Mrs. Cromwell's actions were a reminder that we never truly know the strength of the people around us until they're pushed too far. When Layla stood up for herself, when she showed her mother's quiet strength, it wasn't just a victory for her, it was a lesson for everyone around her. Sometimes, the people who seem the quietest are the most powerful, the ones who can change everything without ever raising their voices. Layla had learned that the loudest voices don't always have the most impact. Sometimes, the most powerful moments come in silence when you simply hold your ground and refuse to be moved. And Mrs. Cromwell? She had learned the hard way that strength doesn't always come in the form of loud confrontation. Layla had shown her that true strength lies in resilience, in standing firm in your own worth, and in treating others with the respect they deserve no matter how small or quiet they seem. Layla's journey wasn't just about her. It was a reminder to everyone: never underestimate the quiet ones, the ones who choose to keep their heads high even when the world tries to tear them down. There's a quiet power in resilience. There's a strength in those who have learned to hold their dignity, even when the world doesn't show them the same respect. So, the next time you see someone who seems quiet, who seems like they're not fighting back, remember Layla's story. Remember that sometimes, their silence is the loudest statement they can make. Their quiet strength might be something you can't even see, but it's there, beneath the surface. And to all the people who have ever felt like they didn't belong, like they weren't enough. Remember this, you are enough. You don't need to shout to be heard. You don't need to fight to prove your worth. Just hold your head high, stay true to who you are, and trust that your quiet strength will speak for itself. In the end, Layla had learned that standing up for yourself wasn't about being the loudest or the most obvious. It was about being true to who you are, no matter what anyone else says. And she had proven that, no matter how hard the fight, resilience always wins.